Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today because we found some records in the attic of a funeral home. Hello, and welcome to the 78 RPM channel. Whether you're new to 78s or an advanced collector, this is your source for information, research, and music about 78 RPM records, cylinders, and radio transcriptions. Hey gang, welcome to the 78 RPM channel. Recently my brother, who as many of you well know by now, is an antiques dealer, purchased the contents of what at one time was a funeral home in Chicago. From the attic of that building came a small collection of 78 RPM discs containing all of the toe-tapping hits of funerals from the 1930s and 40s. There were recordings from 3 different companies in this little stash. The first of these were on the Sherris recording label of New York City. The name at the bottom of the label says Marley R. Sherris, so I assumed he was the organist, but that is not true. Sherris did appear on some 78 RPM discs, but as a bass vocalist, not an organist. He was more well known, however, as an announcer for NBC Radio. Sherris Recordings was indeed his venture, but anecdotal evidence says that John Gart, the pretty famous organist from New York City, was in fact the organist for these discs. John appeared on hundreds and hundreds of records, 78 and LP, as an organist, basically anything that could be played with a keyboard, so everything from organ, church organ, pipe organ, to accordion. And he had a very long career as an entertainer, not just an organist, in New York City. He started all the way back in the 1920s. His first recordings were on Edison. His last recordings were in the mid-1960s for major label LPs. One other interesting note about this label is the reference to the Reeves Sound Studio in New York. This studio recorded and created records for several different labels, and it was the home of General and General Tavern Tunes record labels. They were best remembered as being the company that released Jelly Roll Morton's final 78 RPM recordings. The label also recorded a ton of jazz in the New York area and provided masters for companies like Blue Note and the Liberty Music Shop. The notation Reeves Sound Studios also helps us date this, as we know that the name of the studio was changed to something else in 1942. So obviously these recordings predate 1942. The second label that showed up in this stash were from Summit Records. The Summit Records label produced a series of what they referred to as matched organ records for funeral home use out of their Akron, Ohio studios. Now, I couldn't find a lot of material about the Summit label, but fortunately, all of these records that were found came in Summit record albums. The organist for these records was a gentleman named William H. Meader, and he was an organist and an occasional composer. These discs were on sale as single discs for $3, or you could purchase a set of 10 for $30. However, by purchasing a set, you would receive between 20 and 30 songs shipped to you in this stylish record album. One very interesting note is that according to the album, Meader recorded 130 organ tracks for Summit. The volumes listed on the binder, which number from 4 to 8, contain all 130 of those tracks. So presumably, volumes 1 through 3 contained other music. Maybe they contained inspirational songs or hymns or something like that. But it would appear that these discs were from the late 40s, maybe even as late as the early 50s. Summit did, however, convert over to 33 RPM discs entirely by 1954. So we know it predated that. The final discs are the most interesting, at least to me. They are on the Morrison Recording Labs label, and they contain organ music by Glenn Paxton. Glenn Paxton was apparently a local hotel organist. That is all I can find out about him. In fact, the only reference I was able to dig up came from some material in a Phi Delta Theta convention flyer from French Lick, Indiana in the 1940s. Now, there is a small photo in that, which was too grainy really to be reproduced here, picturing an old man with white hair in the background playing the organ. The reason these discs are so interesting to me, however, is the label. And if you're familiar with Depression-era Jeanette products, you may recognize the border of this label, as it appeared on multiple Jeanette products, including Herwin, Jeanette sound effects records, and Jeanette personal recordings. In addition to the fact that it's always fun finding Jeanette private or personal recordings, or pretty much anything from Jeanette from the 1930s, there was also this. It is a listing of available recordings from Morrison Recording Labs, including 12 of these single-sided 12-inch organ solos by Glenn Paxton. It also includes 8 vocal recordings by Mr. and Mr. Frank Kells. The Kells were musical patrons and founders of the Kells Studio of Fine Arts in 1917. That studio was located in Aurora, which is the city listed on 3 of these discs. The other one lists the city as Geneva, Illinois, which is about 25 miles due north of Aurora. Now, finding out when they went from one studio to the other would probably help date these records, given that all 4 discs are within 10 catalog numbers of each other. Unfortunately, I have had no luck doing that. One final note, Alan Sutton, in his book about American record companies and producers, mentions that the Morrison Recording Labs eventually ended up in Batavia, Illinois, which is on the same road between Aurora and Geneva, pretty much right in the middle. So I'm not quite sure when these were made, but I'm guessing they are in some way related to Jeanette in the 1930s. In any event, I hope you enjoyed this quick look at the remains, get it, of a funeral home in Chicago. If you have any information about any of these labels, especially the Morrison label, let me know. I would be keen to find out more about what are not necessarily the most toe-tapping records, but they're a lot of fun and they have a pretty cool backstory. We'll talk to you next time on the 78 RPM channel.